This is the Alembic Files, and with me is William Ramsey. If you followed us at Alembic Files or any of my previous manifestations, you've heard of William before, and you might have heard him in an interview in a number of other places. His books you might be familiar with Prophet of Evil, good old Aleister Crowley, and Cult Hollywood. Also of recent times, Abomination, which is a documentative work on the West Memphis Three. And now there's another book forthcoming to which he's going to speak entitled Children of the Beast. So, William, thanks for coming back. And if I left anything out, by all means, fill us in and let's get going.
No, I mean, that pretty much covers it all. Thank you for having me back. I'm glad to be back. And I did another one that was like Aleister Crowley, a visual study that is available on Amazon and iBooks and has a little bit more of a multimedia angle.
Okay.
But that's also out there. So the Children of the Beast will be my fourth completed book, and it'll also have a documentary to go along with it.
All right, so to be fair, I would say, folks, yes, and I did not mention the other modalities which he has produced. So you can go to occult911.com, and you can find the full panoply, if you will, of his printed and electronic works and otherwise. So by all means, I didn't get everything, and good that you mentioned that, but we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But now this latest offering that has not yet seen its debut, Children of the Beast, I'm guessing, would Crowley be the Beast?
Correct. So Crowley also went by the Beast 666, or he called himself To-Megatherion, which is the Great Beast in Greek. And really the book tries to follow his ideas through the 20th century, people who were influenced by Crowley to a greater or lesser degree, and show how his distillation of the old mysteries of Western cult tradition has, through him, been seeded through 20th century personalities and events.
Well, let me ask you this. And I think we have to really deal with this, no matter how we feel about it. I'm not sure. Maybe you can tell me. I've got you by a decade or two. But if anybody, and remember, I went through the '60s, as much as I can remember them, and early '70s. A lot of strange stuff. But I can never say. I mean, with Black Sabbath and Coven and all this other stuff that was going on, and some of us trying to work a Ouija board that never did happen, and I'm glad for that. Well, the name Crowley never came up. It only became later, I guess, after 2001, when I guess I put my head down certain rabbit holes that I never did back in the old days, that I discovered him. Is it that I wasn't looking in the right places, 40 years ago, or is it that now there's been some kind of resurgence, and there's a time now when this is on the rise?
I think that, he wasn't emphasized. I think the media was different back then, so it was hard to kind of ascertain a lot of people's deeper ideas that they, inculcated into their own personality and outlook. So now with this, the open availability of information and this information explosion, it's been a lot easier to, as a historian, there's a rich vein or mine of, research gold, so to speak, to really look into these things with a deeper, more, or deeper and broader sense, I guess. So I think that to answer the question, it's a lot easier to look into now, I guess.
All right. So in other words, in the old days, basically you had to deal with the printed word or magazines that might have been niche magazines for that kind of thing. But now today, I mean, you got everything 24/7, worldwide. Everything goes, and now there's more access to it, and perhaps that is also, promoted things for better or for worse. It just expands and amplifies whatever's been out there.
Absolutely. I mean, if you remember, like back in the day, to get a lot of esoteric understandings, a lot of that stuff was printed in, kind of more adult magazines and edgy stuff. So it was a lot harder. The mass media didn't cover it, And a lot of people may not have understood what they were seeing in the 60s and these changes in these other people's beliefs. So now I think, it's like you said, it's like a multi-rich, multiverse environment for media that really allows people to kind of make connections they didn't used to or weren't able to.
Yeah, I mean, it's whatever's out there, whatever's been out there has been definitely amplified. So, I mean, there are people who look and trash the internet because, it's the internet. But of course, then there's things that they like, a lot of conservative stuff, and it's like, well, it's, that's okay. So, I mean, it's like I hate to say this, but it's like a gun. It's not it's not the gun itself. It's not the medium itself. It's how people use it. And that kind of reflects what the purpose of the instrument is, if you will. But let's get back, because, I mean, tell us, what is the tone of the book? I mean, at the end, what have you said to everybody about this?
Well, I think that my conclusion in the book is that, Crowley remains an important person to understand, considering the world we're in and the people who have fashioned it, whether they're elitists or cultural figures, and that a lot of their ideas are couched in the beliefs of a very dangerous and very evil person who considered himself to be the right-hand man of Satan. So, if you have the cosmological viewpoint of a Christian, I think understanding and knowing Crowley and his disciples, I mean, and some of the people in the book are straight disciples, like they followed everything he did and said and believed and then turned them to their own goals. But understanding him and his disciples is vitally important for safely navigating yourself through this world.
All right. What I wanted to share with you, knowing that we might speak in a number of days, but not counting on what I was going to watch on TV in a night where I had insomnia, I watched some documentary on a rather conservative site. Like I said, it might be the History Channel, History 2, or whatever. And it talked about the 60s. And I always laugh when I look at this, because I'm like, okay, I mean, I was there, so like, just what kind of crap are you going to run by me? But it was pretty decent. But the thing that struck me, and I guess it shouldn't be an aha moment, but I never thought about the 60s in this manner, and yet it was always there. And a number of people who were your basic interviewees in a documentary, black background, and they put up their credentials below their face when they speak. A number of them said, along with all that might have been good, and I think there was good at that time, the best we ever came close to, there also was a definite entree of the occult. Right. And that's really what the show was about. So, I mean, they gave it an honest start, and then they went down a different road. And I want to say that I never thought of it that way because I kind of wasn't there. So, if I didn't experience it, and I was playing football, baseball, and thinking about girls, But I have to admit, there was a certain toll that was taken among young males and females that I had gone to school with, enough to make me think, like, gee, what the hell is going on? So what I would say is, the Pandora's box, I think, was opened in the 60s, whatever that means for whatever ills there are today. But I think it was opened in the 60s. And let me just ask you this, with what you've studied now, again, Crowley, when did Crowley die, by the way, William?
1947.
All right. I mean, wherever he is. I mean, we're looking 13 years before the 60s, and certainly another 23 years before the late 60s and 70s, where this kind of stuff kind of gets loosed. What about that influence that may have laid dormant, or did it not lay dormant, and that what we're seeing is only a progression from, let's just say, the time when I say the Pandora's box was opened?
Right. Well, I think that there was, people looking for an opportunity to bring his ideas into the cultural mainstream. And the 60s was really an opportunity for them. And it's interesting that you make that point that there's good and bad in the 60s, because you're not the only person who had that belief. Everybody in the 60s, it was a time of opportunity. There was change, and there actually was an authentic belief in change. But something happened, and a lot of other researchers have said that, it became darkened, like that hope and this new energy from this other generation that was authentically looking for an environment turned into chaos. Like these people came into this, this movement and changed it. People like Charles Manson, who really wasn't a hippie. He was actually a garbage person, but he was mischaracterized as a hippie. I mean, this guy was in and out of, reform schools and jails and stuff like that his whole life. But other people like Leary, who changed the tenor of the 60s by advocating, license to take drugs whenever you want. So there definitely was this view that things were changing for the better, and then things got darkened and soured by the involvement of, people without good intentions. So I do think that it unleashed a Pandora's box. It was this, threshold era where the idea of, really investigating the inside of your mind in a way that hadn't been contemplated, at least in the United States, was now available through, this kind of like this heady mash of Eastern esotericism, drug use, and really the breakdown of, an assault by leading figures upon what could be termed the Judeo-Christian, concept of the ideal life, I guess. So, and it was done in an environment of war and fear of war and nuclear annihilation. I mean, that was a common fear back then. And this fear of the communists, whether it was intentionally engendered by the rulers of the United States or if it was legit, which, I generally take the former as to the latter. But, I mean, it's kind of interesting that, Kennedy was really trying to make peace with the Russians, going around back channel ways to maintain stability and order when his own generals and the crazies in the Pentagon were advocating, conflict and confrontation, only 15 years after the end of World War II. So, but, I mean, that's an important part of this whole book, and, detailing this change in this era. Leary himself there's a connection between Leary and the assassination of, and Leary was a follower of Crowley, which I pretty much show with concrete proof, although he might not have been one in 1963 when he was doing his LSD experiments out of Harvard, which he was kicked out for. But he was involved with, basically providing acid to John F. Kennedy through his association with John F. Kennedy's paramour. And
which one would that be?
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to list it out, but she was, what is her name? I can't remember it. But yeah, so it's really an important part. I think that an important part of the assassination information that, unfortunately is not really emphasized. But her name is Mary Pinchot Mayer, whose husband was a CIA asset, but she was an intermediary between Leary and Kennedy. And there's a really good book out about Mary's ex-husband was Cord Meyer, and there's an excellent book about her that came out. She was actually murdered 1963, and James Jesus Angleton was a CIA player who went to her house and made sure he had her diary. Her diary disappeared. I talk about that in the book. It's kind of an aside with the greater story of Crowley, but it's actually a pretty fascinating element of Leary's life.
But let me just suggest this, because that's what I've been thinking about. I wasn't old enough. I mean, if I had been in college in the 60s, early 60s, I might have had a different view of this and probably would have. Even if I wasn't involved with it, at least I think I would have had kind of the same sensors that would have kind of indicated what was going on. But I time and time again, everybody complains about what's going on now, and it's not a good thing. But I can't get around the fact that no matter what, the 60s were absolutely berserk. I mean, you had the government testing people, even LSD, you can argue, was thrown out there to see what would happen. And in this whole scenario as well, in this country, in the lower 48, you really did have a divide between the Eastern, what do you want to call it, the Eastern culturati and the West.
Right.
I mean, even Tom Wolfe, who recounts the Kesey's trip across country with the Merry Pranksters in the electric Kool-Aid acid test, when they get to go to Leary, they're bummed out by Leary. They think he's an asshole. I mean,
yeah, that was an uncommon opinion of him with his first impression meeting Leary was his his Eastern. I mean, it's weird. He made some kind of weird turn from a Harvard-educated, sociological psychologist to this weird Eastern guru in about 2 years. I mean, it seems forced to me, but
William,
Leary is a very strange figure. But the book I'm referencing is called Mary's Mosaic, the CIA Conspiracy to Murder John F. Kennedy, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and Their Vision of the World Peace, which was written by somebody who had a firsthand relationship to Mary Pinchot Meyer. And she seems to be a very charismatic and compelling figure. And she was murdered, and, the lone nut kind of the black guy did composite was put out there to be blamed for her death. But it's weird. When I was in D.C., I walked right by where they found her. I used to go by there quite frequently when I was in Georgetown in that area, and I remember hearing about, this is 20 years ago, but I remember hearing about that somebody died over there with a connection to the Kennedy assassination. And it's really just an amazing part of the 60s and the assassination story, but that's really not the entire, frame of my book. But
no, but one thing I want to point out, too, and this is because it happens to everyone. Like you and I believe in Jesus Christ, we're Christians, so what happens is we get demonized by all the lunatics that get front and center on mainstream news, which we completely don't relate to. But in this sense also, Leary was given up to everyone on mainstream media as this character, and so everybody associated whatever went on with this supposed lunatic. My point being is that when mainstream news, which is not, it's managed, let's face it, when they're told to do a certain thing, they will cast an individual or an event in a certain light. And so they gave us Leary, when in essence he probably wasn't anything close to what the whole country in that particular mindset, if you want to call them hippies, that's fine. He was not emblematic of that whatsoever. I mean, can you make anything out of what I just said? I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, there's a deeper story of Leary. He had some uncomfortable government connections, clearly.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a nice way of stating it. I mean, his third wife was basically an FBI informant, known, handler. So here's this guy who's supposed to be this representative of the counterculture with an FBI informant, and there were strange moments there where he kind of got away with stuff. You're like, what? And he was busted by the Orange County PD for a very small amount of marijuana, which they would laugh at today. But and he had to leave the country, and he was hanging out with Bernardine Dorn, who was Obama's witch counselor. I mean, Leary called it Bernardine Dorn a witch. But the interesting thing is how he was able to scrape himself off and clean himself up and stay in the United States after, all of his kind of shenanigans, and how he kind of misled and manipulated a whole generation into tuning in, drop. Was it turn on, tune in, turn on, and drop out?
That's right.
That simple slogan, that kind of communistic slogan, encouraged a lot of people not to worry about what was happening in their society. It's like, be a dropout, just do drugs and engage in, licentiousness and cleanse your mind, so to speak. And it's pretty interesting how that conforms to how the Eastern Brahmins or Eastern elite would want to subjugate and keep the masses in a nice state of drugged-out complacency.
And yet I would argue that Pennsylvania was, in the first century or so, in the East, something but in the shadow of what took place out in the West Coast, and that is people don't really think about this much, and for obvious reasons. But Pennsylvania was a hotbed for cults in the first century. I mean, in the 18th, 19th century, and then you get to California, which was obviously the land of fruits and nuts and taco huts.
Right.
And I mean,
still is.
Huh? Still is.
It still is.
I know. But this wave always takes place from east to west, and yet during that 60s revolution, if we can call it that cultural revolution, I think things popped up on both coasts. And I'm also borrowing heavily from what Wolf wrote in the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test when Garcia and the Dead were known as the Warlocks. I mean, there seemed to be a lot of experimental things happening on the West Coast and on the East Coast. And I don't really know how this all works out. But as I think we all know, even to this day, cultural norms, societal norms are created on both coasts, and they work into the hinterland, and then they finally get it. So at that point in time, this environment we're talking about, William, how does the Children of the Beast, I mean, is this the fallow field from which they rise?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, just one more thing about Leary is that the whole thing, the seeding of the whole LSD came out of his time in Harvard. Here's an interesting story: is Huxley and Leary had these conversations about, and this is Aldous Huxley, who clearly met Aleister Crowley, and Crowley made a painting of Huxley, which Huxley's second wife, Chera Huxley, denies, but there's actually a record of that taking place. But Huxley and Leary are talking about. Then Huxley wrote The Brave New World, which is and had that famous speech at Berkeley in '63.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And
love your servitude. Yep.
Yeah, love your servitude. So they're talking about drugs, and you have to kind of take what their conversation was with a grain of salt, how honest it was. But Huxley was a blue-blooded elite who didn't care about drugging the masses, and so here's this guy Leary talking with him, and sure enough, what does Leary do? Goes out and drugs the masses like the Pied Piper of unbridled drug use and irresponsible drug use as some kind of false spiritualism, and created this kind of same type of environment that Crowley did in his Abbey of Thelema and Cefalù in two places, Zihuatanejo and that was in Mexico, and then the other one was Millbrook, which was in upstate New York.
Yep.
And I mean, it's incredible that Leary is associated with the Kennedy assassination, who dies on November 22nd, 1963. And what day does Huxley die? November 22nd, 1963, on acid. That's a historical fact.
That's scary.
Along with it's actually pretty interesting because C.S. Lewis died on the same date as well. So these three pivotal figures in 20th century history all died on November 22nd, 1963.
By the way, I don't want to get into this, but I will say this. I came into C.S. Lewis through a Christian background, and I got to tell you, I got some questions.
Yeah, you're not alone.
Okay.
I've had these discussions with other people who
I'll leave it there.
Have a grain of salt with C.S. Lewis. But, so getting back to your original question, the 60s is really is worthwhile in studying and trying to understand, because it really is the ground spring to 9/11, to our current culture, to the commonality of drugs is what we think is some kind of, party atmosphere and the way to spiritualism. That's what we're told, but is it really something different? Are we willingly involved in our own decadence and our own move towards this cleansing of the mind, so to speak, by our own selves wanting to be drugged out, The entire culture is doing, whether it's legal or illegal drugs. The legal drugs are probably worse than the illegal ones if you think about all the antidepressants and all this other stuff. So, sure. Leary's vision and Huxley's vision are in full force. I just don't think it's realized.
Well, I mean, the problem is, I feel really creepy about this because I'm 62 and I watch TV. And all the commercials, because the advertisers know what the biggest demographic is right now, and I was in the seat, right in the middle, of the baby boomers. And I mean, I see commercial after commercial about this drug, that drug, this drug, cancer centers, drug rehabilitation places, hospice, and I'm like, it is so lugubrious. It's like, will you leave me alone? I mean, now it's like almost we're into a culture of death, and that would necessarily, in a way, not be unexpected from what was going on 40 years ago. But my point to you also is, with all these characters you mentioned, here's my point. I mean, Crowley, bit the bullet in 1947. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. And yet, that really doesn't matter in the sense if you're dealing with spiritual issues, which I think we're dealing with. And I think it's one of the things that Christians and other people are not wont to understand, and that is, you've been warned about flesh and blood and the principalities of darkness. So, that Crowley may have gone from his corporeal being in 47, what else lives on? And I obviously have, beyond any reasonable doubt, experienced this presence. I never knew what Crowley was until like 10 years ago. And all of a sudden, bang, he's there. And I didn't at all fathom how much of a presence he has with people today. And I mentioned this thing.
I mean, that was one of the reasons that impelled me to write my first book, is I really didn't know. I had a topical understanding, but when I realized the depth and breadth of his influence, it was like, whoa, why didn't I know about this? And a lot of it is because he intended his influence to be secret. And that's one of the central doctrines of, his initiatory system, the initiatory systems of all Western esoteric traditions, is silence. So people who know don't tell unless you work your way up work your way up the steps, so to speak, the stairway to heaven. And it's that's like one of his admissions in Magic and Theory of Practice. He has a paragraph that I quote in my first book, which I think is important, explains a lot about him. But he talks about Awas as being, this being who gave him the Book of the Law, as being a lord of initiation. And I think that's one of the central characteristics of Satan and the enemy is, he wants to slowly ingratiate people to an understanding of that knowledge of, his evil, and keep it secret from Christians, and then also shape Christians from crossing over into boundaries where he doesn't want them to go. So, and that's like how this kind of pseudo-Christian church that calls itself Christian, but probably should call itself Christoid, has really kind of dropped the ball in understanding what's taking place, in my opinion, dropped the ball. And that's a very general blanket statement.
Yeah.
But in trying to see that these people who are changing and influencing culture are doing it for nefarious purposes. And they're not unknowing, They know what they're doing. They're doing it willfully. And a lot of them are from, initiatory systems. Like Leary knew Crowley, but he was also a member of something called the Illuminates of Thanateros, which is kind of an offshoot who rejected the kind of rigidity of the OTO system and did kind of a free teaching kind of view. But Thanateros is Greek words for sex and death, or death and sex. So you see these, once you start to peel back the surface of some of these personalities, you see that they really are wolves in sheep's clothing, and really did not have the people they taught, well-being in their that they weren't even interested in it. So,
all right, but before we go any further, I have another leading question to ask you, but we're on the bottom of the hour. William, why don't you talk to people about your website and what is all there that we did a little bit of in the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I have a website that I really haven't worked on in a long time, www.occult911.com, which is an improvement on my former one, which is really reflecting on how lousy my initial website was.
That's all right.
There's some opportunities to see my stuff there, and you can go to Video on Demand. But the best place to go is Amazon to see my books in Kindle and order it. I kind of chose willfully to self-publish, so my works are very idiosyncratic and kind of have a micro budget quality to them, which hopefully you'll find charming. Some people think it's awful.
Well, just get the information out. That's the main thing.
Okay.
No, I mean, with the Alembic Files, what we've dealt with is suppressed history, and we find books that we can, they've not always been published under the best publishers. There was no self-publishing for a long, long time. I mean, that's kind of a creature of the last, maybe 10 years. But
probably 5.
Yeah. So I mean, it's like, well, folks, what do you expect? I mean, is reality and truth all about what yells the loudest and gets the greatest coverage? Or is it about the nugget of truth? And, of course, the latter is not the case. And so what we've done on this show, and what you've been trying to do for many years, and that is to try to break through to people and say, listen, we may not be picked up by Barnes & Noble or Amazon, in bookstores, I should say. But, I mean, it's real and it's true. And the fact that it isn't like a mass consumption item should not be a hindrance to reading it. And let me just say one other thing, and I'm going to throw it back to you. One of the things I think is so imbecilic and childish about where we're going with social media is this thing about like me. Oh, God, really? Like me? And also the other thing with Twitter and all this other stuff, it's like, I don't know. Be my friend.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you said it best. The truth doesn't travel in a pack, so...
Well, that's Robinson Jeffers who said the cold passion of truth hunts in no pack.
No pack, there you go. So, I mean, you said it better than I did. I was paraphrasing it, but, it is what it is. I have my own view, and I wouldn't mind getting my book out to more people.
Sure.
It's really a question of time and expense, too. I mean, a lot of these big publishers already have their networks put out, but I've already kind of explained that to you in former shows, but going the route of big publishing is you give up your own personal views and you give up a substantial portion of ownership to go with them, and that's
right.
Yeah, not something I was willing to do.
No, but in the old days, though, and I would cite one book in particular. I mean, let's get through this real quickly, but I mean, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor by Robert Theobald, who was a rear admiral in the Navy at the time of World War II and served at Pearl, wrote a book and said, here it is. They knew. FDR's cabinet knew. The thing is, nobody in the world knows, for the most part, that book was ever written, and certainly our history books do not reflect that ever happened. But you see, here's the point. The ones who yell the loudest get the biggest coverage. Unfortunately, the herd figures is real. Right. But that's not what we deal in, not you and not me, and we're going to keep on going until we go. But here's the point, too, and I don't know how much you want to get into this, but look, you're making people aware of what's going on. I think you believe, and I know you believe, as I do, that the only rescue is in the belief of Jesus Christ as salvation. That's it. That's all there is. There are no earthly solutions to what's going on, and to think otherwise is crazy. Unfortunately, a lot of evangelicals believe that they can beat this thing down, because I think you and I both know that the New World Order is nothing other than Satan's attempt at takeover to the world. And I know that I've probably stuck my foot in my mouth a couple of times there, but would you please react to William?
Well, yeah, I 100% agree. It's a spiritual war. It's a spiritual contest, and my belief system is 100% based in the truth of what's written in the Bible. And, there is a seduction by, the fallen cherub to, bring people to his way of looking at the world. And unfortunately, a lot of people follow that, worship me and I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. And some people, move at the first, you had me before hello if Satan comes calling, So those people you want to watch out for. Christ said there would be wolves in sheep's clothing and false prophets and false doctrines. And it's important to understand and spot them from a mile away before they're able to, corrupt and degrade you, your family, your friends, and stuff like that into false path of spiritual worship. So,
all right, in this last half hour that we have, and we are in agreement, and we know we are, but still in all, to identify what's going on is something that I think you try to do. And if you will, because when I looked at the list of individuals that you've spoken to in the book, I mean, that is pretty much kind of a map of all that's taken place, I would say probably from post-World War II to today. And I think there is a concerted effort to manipulate, if you will, the American populace. And I'll say this, I'm going to throw it back to you. Understand, folks, also that money rules everything. Tax exemption foundations have done a lot to recast, if you will, the landscape of the United States. And I think that's probably an era, and I think we can talk about that from the end of World War II onward, that has really made an imprint on this country and changed it from what we all have been taught that we were in history books and until today, when we as far as we're concerned, can't recognize ourselves as what we're supposed to be. All right, that's long-winded, but what would you say about that with regard to what you've done in the book and the personages that you have identified?
Well, I would just say that I believe in that, and I think that there are people who want to influence the culture, who are familiar with Crowley and are pushing for this reordering of the world and society, and put it into their kind of view. And, I took pretty much a broad brush to show who these individuals are. And I really kind of broke it down into 4 simple parts, and that is, people who learned at the foot of Crowley and who influenced history, like Israel Regardie, J.F.C. Fuller, Jack Parsons, John Parsons, Grady McMurtry, Joe Garner, the founder of Wicca, Harry Hay, Ian Fleming, the writer of James Bond novels, who was an intelligence handler of Crowley, according to his biographer, and then the people who carried the torch of Crowley's kind of world revolution. So I think that their goal isn't just to change the U.S., but really the New World Order. And you see people like L. Ron Hubbard, Alfred Kinsey Leary, Kenneth Anger, the whole Manson crew, the Beatles, and then the people who are really the modern followers. I broke it down. That's kind of the last kind of general heading is, all these people who a lot of people may not know or be familiar with, but are people who are acquainted. Alan Moore, the writer of V for Vendetta and From Hell, very well-known kind of movies and books, he says he spends half of his time studying the occult and half the time writing. And he's been called the best writer of comic books. This guy's a giant. J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter thing, she's very well steeped. If she's writing it alone or if she's just a header, I don't know. But her books are couched in very skilled occult knowledge. You've got Marilyn Manson. You have Damien Eccles, who's a Crowley follower, who I wrote my earlier book, Abomination, about, who's free, who got out with the help of other occultists and walks the country as supposedly a unjustly convicted man, which is a complete and total fraud, disgusting fraud. Even to hip-hop musicians, there's Jay-Z, who's affiliated and understands Crowley, to the artist of Aliens, H.R. Geiger. So, I take a pretty broad brush, but I think, these are people who have taken Crowley's dictum, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, to heart. And Crowley himself broke that down. Do take action in the world, whatever you want, and make that your law, So a lot of people may not know or see this hidden hand behind all these people and what connects them together, but I think it's important that they do.
All right, we can break this down a bit because, I agree with you, obviously, so there's no discussion or debate about that. But when I look at the list that you have created, and, of course, usually I would say people who make lists, are not really, normal, but that doesn't pertain to you necessarily. I've seen some others, and
I hope not.
No, because I've seen other people who've, just slammed folks with no... And I've been on the object, one of them. But anyway, be that as it may. Besides,
I will attest to you that there's a far more detailed,
yes,
backed up, and footnoted analysis in the forthcoming book.
And that's all I would ask, is if you're going to slam somebody, just give us the evidence, okay, and let us decide for ourselves. I have not been able to say that with some of the castigations against me, but that's okay. But
well, I have been a very rigorous footnoter. My first book had 500 footnotes that somebody went through with a fine-tooth comb, so to speak, and could only find one minor errata.
All right, then let me ask you this. How many pages is this book presently? 400.
So I'm trying to tone it down and kind of pare it down, but, you know, as usual, I overwrote. So, you know, this book was actually in the making for like 2 or 3 years, but I got distracted with other projects. I'm like one of those people who has like 10 different projects. It's like a plate spinner. So, you know.
Yeah, no, you are. And I tell you what, I'm in admiration of it, because I can't even spend one these days. But let me ask you, but I mean, seriously, when did this, I mean, we know that you went through the Crowley thing. We've been all through that. But when did you think you were going to finally come to such a work as this? I mean, seriously, how many years ago?
Well, I think that it actually, right when I was writing my first book, I'm like, not only is this guy, you know, important figure to understand because of so many people who followed him, but look at all these people who followed him. And then my conversations with myriad hosts, you know, we keep going over the people he's influenced, but there's a larger story than just saying, you know, a topical surface statement that, well, he influenced Timothy Leary. Well, how and why? And what did Timothy Leary do to follow Crowley? I mean, a lot of people don't know he followed Crowley to Busada in Algeria. He was a practitioner of the I Ching. He threw the stick to the I Ching like Crowley. He titled his book Confessions of a Hope Fiend, based on Crowley's confessions and, Diary of a Drug Fiend. So, you know, Leary really did inculcate and really follow Crowley in detail, which is detailed in the book, but most people, you know, you don't want to. There's a lot more to the story than just, saying, oh, yeah, Leary really liked him, you know. So that was really what was the impetus to really go into detail about these central figures. Hubbard, Hubbard is a classic example of people who just did not get into a deeper analysis of what he was about, because if they did, they would see that all of his doctrines and his whole religion, which has corrupted the entire world, is based on and couched in Crowley's doctrines and terminology. He just actually changed the terminology kind of and kept the same meaning. So, and he said statements that were incredible, that were right out of the Crowley's books. People have looked into Hubbard and said he wasn't an occultist, but I don't know what they were thinking, because everything this guy did was based on the occult, and he just put it in science fiction terms, so it sounds kind of more modern, but the meaning is the same. So it's about form and function. But he said, Crowley, when he received the Book of the Law, which was his prime book in Egypt in 1904, Crowley said, it came to me like a bolt out of the blue. And what did Hubbard, and this is just one example of one of Hubbard's things, but what did Hubbard say when he received Dianetics? He said, it came to me as a bolt out of the blue. So he uses the same idiom as Crowley. And he did all these references to Crowley. His son said he was a Crowley lover, on multiple forums. So the whole concept of the book is to go into greater detail about what these people really think and show that their actions and the way they rechange the world was based upon, these fundamental concepts of Crowley. Just going back to Hubbard, the kind of conflict and political upheaval that Scientology has created in so many different countries is really incredible when you look at it. Every country is fought with Scientologists. They don't understand its core satanic principles, and they refuse to acknowledge them, which is really a research oversight, in my opinion. And when you get in there, you see the mind control is kind of like the Satanist's handmaiden. It's always there when you're involving with people who believe, Lucifer is their god. It's always there, and they're always using mind control. And the Scientology is like a self-propagating mind control monstrosity.
All right.
So the purpose of the book is really to try to ascertain these followers in a broader and deeper sense. It's an attempt.
All right. Well, in the time we have left, I guess I got three major questions to ask you. But one of the things is, and you and I were through this for about maybe a year or two, discussing Crowley, and that is when I had mentioned to you and helping out with the pronunciation of this thing, because I always screw it up. Crowley was tight with a German, shall we say, principal in the United States, at least during the First World War. Is his name Veith?
Say that one more time.
Do you remember? You remember we talked about Crowley being involved with a German newspaper publisher in the United States?
Oh, Vierek?
Vierek, that's it, Vierek. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what I took away from all that, and we did have discussions about this, because Crowley was obviously very much in touch with Vierek, and I think that took place across both world wars. Would that be correct?
Absolutely, 100%. Crowley was really kept in touch with a lot of people in his life. He was unusual in the sense, well, not unusual, but for a literary person of his caliber, he always was keeping correspondence with his long-term friends, and George Vierek was one of them.
All right, now, but I would submit to you that to a certain extent, I believe that Crowley's like carnival appearance with the occult kind of hid the fact that, and this is what took me, and that he was very much involved with communications between Germany and England, at least through World War I and possibly through World War II. And I'll just leave it there because I want to add something else on, but I want to give you an opportunity to speak to that. Are we okay with the fact that Crowley had some, obviously, political ties that were heavy duty during the first, half of the 20th century?
Yes, no doubt. Very heavy-duty political ties that are not covered in a lot of his biographers who take a more cultural view of his, magical practices. But a lot of those political connections are glossed over in a lot of his biographies. So, he is a very complex, multifaceted person who had astonishing connections to people in power. And, a lot of those people deny it and don't state it, but, he really was, they kept him at arm's distance, but he seemed to have a lot of entree still within and to the ruling classes, the elites, and that was really who he identified with it for himself as a member of the, Illuminati and a member of the aristocracy of England at the apex of its power. I mean, he had friends with J.F.C. Fuller, who was, was probably one of the most influential military tacticians for the German army, strangely enough. The English didn't adopt him, but, J.F.C. Fuller was one of two Englishmen invited to Hitler's 50th birthday party. So, he was there, and Crowley was in Weimar, Germany. God knows what he was really doing, but he was clearly constantly sending correspondence back to England when he was either in France or Germany. And, there's still a greater story to be told about all those connections. I mean, when I first started, and I think I told you this prior, when I first started studying Crowley, I didn't think that he was a member of British intelligence, and now I'm 100% convinced he was a significant member of that group.
Research that I've done would indicate that as well, separate from what you found. So it wasn't like I saw the same things that you did, but we came to the same conclusion. In the 10 minutes we have left, one of the things I wanted to ask you was this: besides Crowley, I think we can admit was probably a decent heavy hitter politically behind the scenes that we will never learn about. So that the whole spiritual, mystical thing will be downplayed. Although I will say this, I don't know if you're aware of this, William, but Bob Rosio wrote a book about Hitler and the occult. And in the bunker, when the Russians came in, they found I don't know how many dead Buddhist monks. Have you ever heard that story at all?
Yeah, they were Tibetan monks.
Yep.
And he had them all murdered. There were like 300 of them.
So the point was,
So, back to the whole notion of this kind of secret knowledge and Tibet and Shambhala. I mean, Hitler did some horrific things to his own population. I mean, they were all hiding out when the Russians came in. They were hiding out in the sewers of Berlin, and he had the sewers flooded and killed hundreds of thousands of people. You know, on his orders. I mean, it was the Nero option, is what he called it.
Well, I mean, when you deal with someone like that, I mean, you know, he'll double-cross everybody to the end.
Oh, everybody. He was double-crossing everybody the whole time, constantly, yeah.
He was a messenger, and I don't know how you feel, but I'll just mention this. I don't think he died in that bunker, but that's another thing.
Yeah, that's a whole other story. Well, that's up to dispute.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of those guys got out. I mean, I'll tell you right now, Borman, they said that, you know, he died and there's all this big cover-up, but I actually have met Borman's granddaughter. She was in Austin, Texas, of all places. So he was able to get out with his children, and she operates under a different name, but that's a whole other story.
That's okay, but I mean, I would say that most of the people who were supposed to get out from Nazi Germany to the Western Hemisphere, they got there. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, they got there. They had tons of money and spoils and stuff like that.
So let me ask you this in the time we have left. You do name a number of extremely interesting personages, Kinsey and his wife, with what they supposedly did research-wise with sexual mores or otherwise in the United States. Can you talk to that at all?
Well, you know, Kinsey was, claimed to be this sexologist. He was a doctor, but he wasn't a doctor of, you know, anything having to do with human anatomy. I think he was a zoologist who really followed his passion and was financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. But he had traveled to Crowley's, he would travel to Crowley's Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù with Kenneth Anger and, you know, really investigated and was very interested in obtaining Crowley's diaries. He was like a collector, kind of like a collector of all kinds of weird sexual regalia, and Crowley's diaries was one of them. But, you know, a lot of his research has been debunked. And
yes,
he was
it has. Yep. Mm-hmm.
very deranged character. And if you really want to find out the real nature of his character, you can research on how he died. I won't go into detail about that, but he was definitely an advocate of this kind of change. And a lot of his research really advocated, you know, sexual license, but it was based upon flawed scientism. It wasn't even scientific. He used as his case studies people in jails and, you know, all kinds of interesting people, but, you know, it was all skewed and it was not objectively honest or scientific at all.
But my point also, and I'll let you say that for yourself because I feel the same way, but it doesn't mean much when I say it myself, and that is, that was skewed for a purpose. It was to break down the moral barriers. It was to make it. I mean, I can't say it anything better than the 60s were like screw without guilt. I'm sorry.
And that was the doctrine that they put out, but the reality is that a lot of people were very damaged by that doctrine. I mean, you can say that topically, but, you know, if you look into the individual records of people who went through that revolution, there was all kinds of personal torment and bad feelings and really uncomfortable moments. And, you know, I mean, and it wasn't, this was like Congress, but it definitely had all kinds of ramifications. I mean, there were all kinds of people with STDs and, I mean, it was really pretty ugly in a lot of ways.
Oh, no, it was debauchery to the max, and I will admit it myself. I mean, when I found out what was going on, when I finally became, like, sentient to this kind of stuff, I mean, it was screw without guilt. I mean, it was that's it. It was like absolute ribaldry. I mean, come on, who's kidding? No. And I'll admit it myself. You know, unfortunately, I think it definitely had ramifications later on. And I think when you look at TV today and what's allowed, that's an extension of what we dealt with. Every generation, so to speak, or every whatever it is, how many generations, just break down the moral code somewhat. I mean, yeah, it's rigid to a point, and that's okay. I understand that. But then it gets to a point where it's like, okay, is this what the intention was? No, I don't think so. But as we get into the end also, you've got a nexus here between Leary, Anger, Beausoleil, Manson, Page, and also and I'll end it with this: Lennon and McCartney. Can we all lump them together?
Yes, strangely enough, you can. I mean, there are. Leary was, not only the Pied Piper of acid, but he was kind of an everyman and everywhere, kind of a zealot character who was with all of these people at strange, different times. I mean, he definitely coveted the limelight and was able to get into the limelight. I mean, I think he was at with Lennon at his when he was in bed with his witch wife Yoko Ono, who's an admitted witch. These guys it was incredible. Anger lived with Beausoleil, here's Leary with Robert Anton Wilson, who's hanging out with all these other people. I mean, it's really the 60s when you peel away these people's stuff, and I've read into Lennon and Yoko Ono's practices when they were in New York. I mean, it's straight witchcraft. I mean, they had all kinds of, they would take, basically a spell, like a fortune cookie statement, and stick it into, the tongues of cattle. And I mean, really weird, heavy-duty stuff.
What?
They had their own, tarot card reader who would follow them around that they paid, like their own kind of New Age witch. I mean, it's really heavy. And then here's Anger, who shows up and meets the killer of John Lennon like a week before he kills him. So Anger is there, and Chapman says to Anger, "These bullets are for Lennon." I mean, it is unbelievable, how people have missed this. And Anger is also with, living with Beausoleil, who's a member of the Manson family. And the concept of the family is, and there's other similarities between the doctrines of Manson and what he's stated and the doctrines of the Process Church of the Final Judgment.
Lastly, and I can't help but ask, we talk about John Lennon separate from McCartney. What about Lennon and McCartney and the Beatles? Are they bad guys?
I think they were handled. So I think that the Beatles really were a vehicle of cultural change, and somebody was behind them. And, I'm not doing the Adorno theory, but there were other people involved. And one of the more interesting characters is this guy who came out, it's kind of like the Beast of England. I'm forgetting his name, but he was they had all kinds of handlers. A lot of these guys did, and the Beatles, they changed significantly over,
a short period of time, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was just an immediate change, and there's remarkable statements that they made. I mean, Lennon's last recorded statement to an interviewer was with his wife. He said the whole concept of the Beatles was to do what you will. Availability of information in this information explosion, it's been a lot easier to, as a historian, there's a rich vein or mine of, research gold, so to speak, to really look into these things with a deeper, more, or deeper and broader sense, I guess. So I think that to answer the question, it's a lot easier to look into now, I guess.
All right. So in other words, in the old days, basically you had to deal with the printed word or magazines that might have been niche magazines for that kind of thing. But now today, right. You got everything 24/7 worldwide. Everything goes, and now there's more access to it, and perhaps that is also, promoted things for better or for worse. It just expands and amplifies whatever's been out there.
Absolutely. If you remember, back in the day, to get a lot of esoteric understandings, a lot of that stuff was printed in, kind of more adult magazines and edgy stuff. So it was a lot harder. The mass media didn't cover it, and a lot of people may not have understood what they were seeing in the '60s and these changes in these other people's beliefs. So now I think it's like you said, it's like a multi-rich, multiverse environment for media that really allows people to kind of make connections they didn't used to or weren't able to.
Yeah, it's whatever's out there, whatever's been out there has been definitely amplified. There are people who look and trash the internet because, it's the internet, but of course then there's things that they like, a lot of conservative stuff, and it's like, well, it's, that's okay. So, it's like I hate to say this, but it's like a gun. It's not it's not the gun itself, it's not the medium itself, it's how people use it. and that kind of reflects what the purpose of the instrument is, if you will. But let's get back, because I mean, tell us, what is the tone of the book? I mean, at the end, what have you said to everybody about this?
Well, I think that my conclusion in the book is that, you know, Crowley remains an important person to understand, considering the world we're in and the people who have fashioned it, whether they're elitists or cultural figures, and that a lot of their ideas are couched in the beliefs of a very dangerous and very evil person who considered himself to be the right-hand man of Satan. So, you know, if you have the cosmological viewpoint of a Christian, I think understanding and knowing Crowley and his disciples, I mean, and some of the people in the book are straight disciples, like they followed everything he did and said and believed and then turned them to their own goals. But understanding him and his disciples is vitally important for safely navigating yourself through this world.
All right. What I wanted to share with you, knowing that we might speak in a number of days, but not counting on what I was going to watch on TV in a night where I had insomnia, I watched some documentary on a rather conservative site. Like I said, it might be the History Channel, History 2, or whatever. And it talked about the 60s. And I always laugh when I look at this, because I'm like, okay, you know, I mean, I was there, so like, just what kind of crap are you going to run by me? But it was pretty decent. But the thing that struck me, and this is the Alembic Files, and with me is William Ramsey. If you followed us at Alembic Files or any of my previous manifestations, you've heard of William before, and you might have heard him in an interview in a number of other places. His books you might be familiar with Prophet of Evil, good old Aleister Crowley, Cult Hollywood. Also of recent times, Abomination, which is a documentative work on the West Memphis Three. And now there's another book forthcoming to which he's going to speak, entitled Children of the Beast. So, William, thanks for coming back. And if I left anything out, by all means, fill us in and let's get going.
No, I mean, that pretty much covers it all. Thank you for having me back. I'm glad to be back. And I did another one that was like Aleister Crowley, a visual study that is available on Amazon and iBooks, and has a little bit more of a multimedia angle.
Okay.
But that's also out there. So the Children of the Beast will be my fourth completed book, and it'll also have a documentary to go along with it.
All right, so to be fair, I would say, folks, yes, and I did not mention the other modalities which he has produced. So you can go to occult911.com, and you can find the full panoply, if you will, of his printed and electronic works and otherwise. So by all means, I didn't get everything, and good that you mentioned that, but we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But now this latest offering that has not yet seen its debut, Children of the Beast, I'm guessing, would Crowley be the Beast?
Correct. So Crowley also went by the Beast 666, or he called himself To Megatherion, which is the Great Beast in Greek. And really the book tries to follow his ideas through the 20th century, people who were influenced by Crowley to a greater or lesser degree, and show how his distillation of the old mysteries of Western cult tradition has, through him, been seeded through 20th century personalities and events.
Well, let me ask you this. And I think we have to really deal with this, no matter how we feel about it. I'm not sure. Maybe you can tell me. I've got you by a decade or two. But if anybody, and remember, I went through the '60s, as much as I can remember them, and early '70s. A lot of strange stuff. But I can never say. I mean, with Black Sabbath and Coven and all this other stuff that was going on, and you know, some of us trying to like work a Ouija board that never did happen, and I'm glad for that. Well, the name Crowley never came up. It only became later, I guess, you know, after 2001, when I guess I put my head down certain rabbit holes that I never did back in the old days, that I discovered him. Is it that I wasn't looking in the right places, you know, 40 years ago, or is it that now there's been some kind of resurgence, and there's a time now when this is on the rise?
I think that he wasn't emphasized. I think the media was different back then, so it was hard to kind of ascertain a lot of people's deeper ideas that they, inculcated into their own personality and outlook. So now with this, the open...
I guess it shouldn't be an aha moment, but I never thought about the 60s in this manner, and yet it was always there. And a number of people who were your basic interviewees in a documentary, black background, and they put up their credentials below their face when they speak. A number of them said, along with all that might have been good, and I think there was good at that time, the best we ever came close to, there also was a definite entree of the occult. Right. And that's really what the show was about. So, I mean, they gave it an honest start, and then they went down a different road. And I want to say that I never thought of it that way because I kind of wasn't there. So, if I didn't experience it, and I was playing football, baseball, and thinking about girls, But I have to admit, there was a certain toll that was taken among young males and females that I had gone to school with, enough to make me think like, gee, what the hell is going on? So what I would say is, the Pandora's box, I think, was opened in the 60s, whatever that means for whatever ills there are today. But I think it was open in the 60s. And let me just ask you this, with what you've studied now, again, Crowley, when did Crowley die, by the way, William?
1947.
All right. I mean, wherever he is. I mean, we're looking 13 years before the 60s, and certainly another 23 years before the late 60s and 70s, where this kind of stuff kind of gets loosed. What about that influence that may have laid dormant, or did it not lay dormant, and that what we're seeing is only a progression from, let's just say, the time when I say the Pandora's box was opened?